Welcome to the High Performance Hockey Podcast. Today we're joined by Patrick Love, an applied sports scientist at Catapult Sports, Adam Douglas, the sports science and performance director for the Montreal Canadiens, Stephane Gervais, the head strength and conditioning coach for the Montreal Canadiens American Hockey League farm team, the Laval Rocket, and Kevin Ricks, an associate athletic trainer at Notre Dame. I will post all of the bios of these individuals in show notes. It's a fantastic conversation. Today we talk about all things external load, specifically the use of Catapult in the various environments in which they work. It's a great conversation full of insight from various demographics in terms and measures of the landscape, Division I college hockey, American Hockey League, and obviously the National Hockey League, and then what Catapult's doing in the hockey realm in terms and measures of the technologies that they offer. It's a fantastic hour and a half of chat. Welcome to the podcast. Welcome to the podcast, gentlemen. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Dan.
Really excited to chat with some really high-end professionals here in various sports using Catapult technology. And it's going to be a fantastic and interesting hour talking about your unique experiences using the technology and how you make decisions and how you use it on a daily basis. But I want to start, Patrick, if I could, with you. You're the customer success specialist and a sports scientist at Catapult. So, A, what the heck do you do? And then I want to ask a little bit more about the technology and what it is Catapult does in terms of the external load.
There's a team of us that do this. There's about 10 of us. We just refer to ourselves as applied sports scientists. But when we're talking with people that are in the technology industry, customer success specialist is more broadly used. I guess just to give you a little bit of background on Catapult, there's two different branches to our company. There's a wearable side, we call it performance and health. And then there's a video side, which is tactics and coaching. So I'm a customer success specialist within performance and health on the wearable side. Really kind of a mouthful there, but what my job really is not product success, it's customer success. We're trying to understand our customers and how they can best use our products to get a solution in their environment. Really just comes down to building and maintaining relationships with our customers. Big part of that is onboarding them when they're just getting started with us, understanding how to use our wearable. As they progress down the years, helping them with special projects that they may have. Adam, when he had the job, he helped us out with a multi-mechanical model in Edmonton. That's an example of where sports science is very heavily involved. And then we're also a voice internally for our customers. One thing that Adam and I talk about all the time is things that trends that he sees and where we could help as a company grow so that our customers are getting what they want and what they need. I guess my big, KPI is if we're retaining customers, but I also do help assist with sales. University-wide deals are kind of a big thing right now. We're not just going after football, but all sports on campus for a university. Yeah, that's kind of it in a nutshell.
Outstanding. Adam, I want to pass it to you because I know you've worked and you've carried that title before your current appointment in the National Hockey League. But we talked about this off air. We've got very different demographic here, from people that don't know anything about the technology to people that have worked with it for years. So if you could give me a rudimentary, what is this technology in terms of the GPS unit? What's it measuring? And why is it important that you feel in team sport?
Yeah, so one of the key things, the key differentiators with our sport of hockey is it happens indoors. So it's really important that we don't just say a GPS unit. Catapult in a nutshell is actually, it's an inertial movement device, meaning we can measure based off the direction, the speed from an acceleration standpoint, and the magnitude of that movement. We can use those numbers to apply an external load value to it. So essentially what we're doing is external load monitoring inside. There is an add-on you can add to Catapult called Clear Sky, which is a local positioning system or LPS system. So unless you're one of those teams that plays in the stadium series or is outside, then you can use it as a fully functioning GPS unit. Most of us use it as an LPS system in our rinks or as an inertial system, meaning just we're essentially looking at the values that Catapult kicks back to us. So I think that's really important for people to understand. And I think one of the things that Catapult did, so I spent 3 years before I joined the Canadians with Catapult in Patrick's role. One of the things that I really liked about Catapult when I joined them, and they've continued on now after I left, is they really try to put industry sport experts front facing with the clients. So they hired me to essentially lead up their hockey division because they wanted somebody that could understand the numbers that their units are kicking out and be able to put that into hockey context for the clients and the coaches that we work with. And that's kind of one of the key big things I always say Catapult, I think, does very well, is when I call them, I'm not talking to just a customer success specialist in Australia or Boston or London, England. I can get right to Patrick Love and I can say, Patty, this is what I saw at practice today. What do you think? And because I know Patrick's background in the sport, he knows what I'm talking about versus just somebody on the other end. So I think that's one of the big things that kind of sets Catapult aside. Going back to your question about what is it actually, we essentially can measure all of the movements that the players do on the ice, and that prescribes a value to the actions that they're doing. There's hundreds and thousands of metrics that Catapult can kick out to people, but essentially you can put all of those metrics into 3 buckets: volume, intensity, and asymmetry. And then once you have that bucket, you need to dig through that and figure out what metrics best describe your environment. So for me here in Montreal, my main volume metric is player load. And I don't want to speak for some of the other teams around the league, but some of them use on ice load as their main volume metric. And the difference between that is very simple. Player load uses all of the bands within Catapult Speaks. If you think low, medium, high, very high movement, that would be like band 1, band 2, band 3, band 4. Player load uses all of those. On ice load drops player load band 1 when essentially they're not doing much. Because in our sport, there's always a lot of constant movement happening, or they're just standing still. So on ice load just drops that player load band 1. They have an extremely high correlation of like 0.99, but it's just the terminology and the method that you like to use. I know some of the people like on ice load because that sinks in better with the coaches. Yes, that is the work that they did on the ice versus player load. Me, I use player load because when I started using Catapult with Hockey Canada back in 2014, they hadn't done a lot of work in hockey yet. And player load was a value that I could refer back to in the literature because its algorithm and equation had been published. So I knew exactly what I was dealing with. And so now that's my frame of reference for everything we do. That's our frame of reference here with the Canadians, because that's what I've coached our players to understand, our coaches to understand. Steph and his group down in Laval, that's our organizational terminology. So we all have the same language.
Great. I know you mentioned volume, intensity, and asymmetry. You said player load for volume, intensity metrics, and asymmetry. What would you use in terms of measures of what you hold important?
Yeah, so for me, from an intensity perspective, I like a few different things. Player load per minute is a big one for me. High intensity work duration. So player load per minute is essentially a density metric. So we take the accumulated player load of certain sections divided by 60. So we can look at values on a per minute basis. One of my biggest ones from an inertial standpoint is that high intensity work duration. So that looks at time accumulated above a certain threshold of player load. In Catapult speak, that's anything that happens on the ice above player loads bands 3 and 4. Because that's when I know, like I always say, that's when hockey happens. So that's when I know they're battling, they're skating, they're back checking, they're shooting, they're working both on and off the puck. I know based off, my IP or my corporate knowledge, just watching and observing and my coaching eye, that's when hockey is occurring on the ice. So think of it as a stopwatch. So if they're just skating or gliding, it's not accumulating that. The moment they break a certain threshold of that player load accumulation, that stopwatch turns on. And then they will coast back down, that stopwatch turns off. And so we can track that in games. So we know that certain players should have X amount of high intensity work duration based off their time on ice. It's not a 1-to-1 ratio, but we play on you said a lot of frictionless ice surface. So they glide a lot. So they're not doing that much work. They're still working, but they're not doing a ton of work. So we know, high-end players should have kind of between 30 to 35% of their time on ice in a high-intensity work duration. And obviously that scales. The less they play, the higher we want that because of energy reserves and their opportunity to recover and push back out. So that's kind of like the main intensity metrics. Then from an asymmetry perspective, I've actually started to move away from the asymmetry stuff a little bit because hockey's an asymmetrical sport. But I do think there's specific times, especially in the return to play process, where you can look at normative data of players to make sure that we are getting them back to some of the normative left-right data that they had before they got hurt. What I like to look at there is mainly their higher threshold output. So we can look at high force strides, both left and right. So again, going back to kind of what I talked about earlier about one of the things I think Catapult does really well was they put hockey people in place. I also think early on in their hockey development, they really tried to understand the sport. So they spent a lot of time and they actually patented a stride detection algorithm. So using the force tracings of the inertial units, they were able to detect left and right strides. So now you can assign a force value to that. It's just a resultant force, but you can now say, okay, he put X in through his right leg, X through his left leg. And so we use that a lot more normative data for players kind of through that return to play process. And when I say I want that high threshold, because I think, just like if you're running or jogging, you can disguise a limp a little bit, but as soon as you have to push and drive out of that or those 3 to 5 strides to get you up to speed in hockey, the acceleration occurs, it's hard to hide that output when you're really asked to push.
2 follow-up questions. Rixie, do you use anything different for intensity that is LPS-based, clear sky, as opposed to just the inertial things? And then Steph, with the asymmetry stuff, how are you using that in conjunction with other tools you have at your disposal, like force plates and things like that?
Yeah, I can jump in on that. The one intensity metric that we tried to use in our LPS system was looking at high-speed distance traveled, which was interesting to kind of track and see. Sometimes guys would be moving a lot, but if they weren't traveling at high speed, we were really trying to tease that out of where do they look like in games, how much high-speed distance do they travel in games, and how much time is spent above that. And the LPS system did allow us to do that, which was pretty interesting, as well as the things that Adam was talking about as well. We've been trying to look at this year.
Forgive my ignorance real quick, Steph, before you answer. Adam, you corrected me, and I'm glad you did. IMD, that is the non-clear sky. That is the non-quote unquote, you don't need satellites for, correct? It's the inertial movement device, correct? As opposed to clear sky, which you do need the system for set up inside the rink. Am I accurate?
Yeah, it's the exact same unit. So the unit doesn't change. You just essentially turn off the GPS so it doesn't drain the battery when you use it for hockey so it lasts longer. And that's just using the inertial movement. That's just like kind of what Catapult's base level is. And a lot of the metrics are based off that. And then the LPS system that Kevin just related to, or Clear Sky, that allows us to layer on the positional data in conjunction with the recording inertial data.
Great. Thank you for the clarification. Steph, back at you on your question in terms of your usage on the asymmetry and the other metrics that you hold value in.
So yeah, with the asymmetry, we were rehabbing an ACL guy. That's definitely something we looked at once we got him on the ice. The other things we're using in conjunction with that, we're fortunate enough in our organization, so Montreal and Laval, to have a 1080 sprint. So that also gives us some asymmetry profiles. I'd say it's really on my side in the infancy of looking at both of those, looking at the asymmetries on Catapult, looking at the asymmetries in the 1080 on the ice, and then also looking at our force plate data, which definitely we're pretty dialed, I'd say, on asymmetries and things we're looking at with that. But it's from the top down. Like, this stuff is driven with Adam, the stuff that he's put in place, and we try to run things in Laval as Adam would in Montreal. So we have the luxury of having some of these other sports science tools that maybe other organizations don't have. And, we're trying to use it to, drive decision making and give our athletes the best possible experience of how can we get them back and make sure we're, ticking the boxes that we need to tick, and, make sure we're not missing anything, or at least limiting the things like that.
Great. I'm going to tackle this next question. Kevin, I want to go right at you here with your usage at Notre Dame. I think sometimes when I look at technology, and sometimes we have solutions desperately seeking problems as opposed to the other way around, right? Problems desperately seeking solutions. Take us back to the procurement of your technology at Notre Dame. What questions were you trying to answer right back in the day before you procured the technology? What was your problem that you were trying to solve? And then how has that changed? And other problems have emerged since you procured the technology?
So wearables and technology has not been new to us. We've been monitoring internal load through heart rate for years, actually, here with our hockey team.
Sure.
And feel pretty dialed about how we've used that in the past. I think recently we started asking ourselves more about like what part are we missing? We felt good about how we were using internal load, but really started asking the questions of what's affecting that and how can we measure what is causing these changes in our internal load. So we had to look to find a way to get something external. Some of the heart rate systems do offer a little bit of that data, and that's actually probably what kind of started it. Was we started looking at that a little bit, and I'll be honest, I wasn't totally confident in what I was seeing in some of those numbers that were coming from the heart rate unit, trying to basically simulate an external load. We also here at Notre Dame, as Pat mentioned earlier, we have like kind of a larger contract with multiple teams using this Catapult already. Several of our field-based sports, court sports, were already using Catapult. So it was not an unfamiliar thing to us either. So I guess to answer your real question, that we were just trying to find out what was causing the changes in our internal load. And how can we measure that? And can we use that to help us affect that internal load? Because we really felt that the internal load is what we were trying to control to a bit and monitor and make sure we're tracking properly to keep our guys as fit as they can be and potentially even work on the injury prevention side. But being able to look at the external loads and then also from a return to play standpoint was one thing that me personally was very interested in.
Sure.
Because I felt that the internal load only gave us so much in that category. We could really dial that in and make sure that we were getting him back up cardiovascular, but we don't know that we were really creating game-like and practice-like situations for him from a load standpoint. So those are two of the biggest things that pushed my interest level in trying to get this done for our hockey program.
What's really interesting and in the sport of hockey is that, the use of external load monitoring is still relatively new. When I first started using it back in 2014 with Hockey Canada and the women's program, I think there was like one NHL team, the Flyers maybe, and like really that was it. We hadn't started to see it leak over. You could look at research programs about external load and GPS in field hockey, rugby, soccer. We had all that. But hockey was inundated with this internal load monitoring because that's all we could do. And I agree with what Kevin says about, he didn't really like what he was seeing from an internal load perspective with heart rates. And I feel like a lot of times people have defaulted to monitoring heart rates in hockey because it's what the technology allowed us to do at the time. So people could do it. I fully agree with you, Kevin. One of the reasons we started using Catapult way back when with Hockey Canada was I didn't like what I was seeing with heart rate. For us, heart rate as an internal load monitor is a response to something. But if you don't know what that response is, how can you make educated or proper decisions based off of what's happening? Also, hockey is a volume-based game. If you go on the ice with coaches, they're going to work to the length of the ice they booked. So if they book an hour, we skate an hour. If we book 2 hours, we skate 2 hours. And a lot of times they'll be like, well, I want those players' heart rates as high as possible. Well, we know as strength and conditioning coaches and people with physiology backgrounds, you don't always want to max out a heart rate all the time. Plus, as the season goes on, if we get a fitness response from athletes, we actually want their heart rates to go down over time. And a lot of coaches will be like, that player's heart rate's going down. They must not be in shape. It's actually, they're in better shape than when they started the season. So that's, I think, a lot of the stories of people who start using this is that heart rate tells a piece of the story, but not all of the story. And the other reason, we kind of got into it with Hockey Canada was we've all worked and played and have experienced elite level coaches in hockey. The philosophy of hockey is the coach's word is gold, right? A lot of times, like that's just what it is. So we also know there's a discrepancy between athlete perception of practice and coach perception of practice. And a lot of times coaches are going to win whatever that argument of how easy or hard the session should be. And, for us with Hockey Canada short-term competition, at the end of the day, we were going to follow the coach, but I never liked that we couldn't measure what the athletes were doing. Like, it was just us versus the coach, and the coach would always win until we had tangible numbers to say, practice on Monday was X, practice on Tuesday was Y, practice on Wednesday should be Z. And so now we have that tangible way to value that. And then you could potentially layer in the heart rate on top. So you can say, we've done X amount of work over the last few days. Our heart rate response is this. So we know what that means from a fitness fatigue perspective.
Outstanding. And it's going to lead right into my next series of questions. Targeted interventions. Okay, so great. You've got the technology. You've had the opportunity to measure those key indicators, whether it's player load, explosive efforts, high speed distance. The question is from a micro or macro standpoint, and I imagine everybody's environment is different. How is that crafted decision makings with key decision makers like the coaches? Is it a microcycle approach? Does it change practice schedule? And then on the tail end of that, I want to tackle this one at a time, which I really want to get into is the return to play element. So I guess the first question is, from a weekly, monthly perspective, the information that you've procured, how does that drive your planning? Regular season, let's talk. Kevin, can I ask you first? I know you said your men's ice hockey and your football, correct?
Yeah, I do help out with our football program as well, yeah. They are much more dialed in that category than we are in hockey. We're 1 year in with Catapult here.
Okay.
So I'll be honest, this past season to me was a lot of just watching, collecting data. I don't know that I had the confidence yet to go to coach and say we needed to make a significant change, just because I just didn't really feel that we had enough data to support what I was thinking, maybe, even though we had some decent conversations, but I was never going to dig my foot in and be like, we got to back off or we got to go harder here. I really felt we needed to get that whole year worth of data in and really see what games look like, what our practices look like, how do we look like coming back from Christmas break, those kind of things to be able to now next year, hopefully get a little more involved in that. Football is very dialed with those things, though. They've got years of data. They know by position what their practice should look like. They know what a game looks like, and they're really dialed in on making both short-term daily decisions and week-to-week decisions with that. So I'll be honest, I'm not the sports science guy over there, though. So I'm not really dealing with those numbers, but I do watch over the shoulder when I am there some, and I am involved with the return to play part, which is a very big part of that as well. So
that's outstanding. It's interesting. I feel like you and I are in the same boat a little bit. I've had a year to work with the technology, and I'm just getting comfortable with player load. And really the questions that I wanted to answer is, hey, what does the game look like? What does the practice look like? What are my positional demands? And then just trying to collect and see what that is before making any kind of rash decisions. But that was a year for me of just trying to try to find what those answers were. So I, like you, hopefully next year will be able to make more informed decisions regarding targeted interventions. Passing it back to you, Adam. I know that you've done this for a long while, over 10 plus years. So walk me through, perhaps for the Montreal Canadiens, Steph, interject as well in the American League, because I'm sure that you guys are married at one of the same in terms and measures of what you're measuring and maybe different interventions. But Adam, during their regular season, 82 game National Hockey League schedule, that's demanding, man. That's 82 mini car crashes. How does that drive decision-making for you? Are your head coaches, assistant coaches, are they receptive to the message in terms of changing schedule around? How do you use that during the course of the season?
Here in Montreal, we're very fortunate in that our head coach, Marty St. Louis, is fully bought in and receptive to the information. Steph will have a unique answer because the American League schedule is totally different than the NHL. As you said, we have 82 games, 82 car crashes every other night. Like the density of our schedule, I would put up against any league across the world, and that, our players get so beat up. So we really have to manage that schedule very well. And, one of the things that is really my task is to work with Marty to help put our players in the best position to succeed for a game that's going to happen the very next night. The other interesting part about, hockey is we practice a lot. Skating is a skill, and people can debate about how much you should be on or off the ice. Our players love being on the ice. You're not taking that away from them.
Sure.
And Marty, as a former player, Hall of Famer, loves being on the ice. And so if we can better manage what they do on the ice, there should be no problem for them to skate, 6 days a week. Like, that's their skill. I'm not going to take that away from them. So what we do here in Montreal is from a macro level point of view, I look at team averages. Okay. So we look at a 7-day rolling average, but we'll first look at our monthly calendar when it comes out and the schedule and work with when do we travel? What time zones are we going to be in? How do we manage that? When do we have our games? When will we have our rest days? And you're not moving any of those. So you can't move that. There's certain rules, the CBA, it doesn't matter. Then what we'll do is, okay, what is, manageable or movable? And what we try to do is keep guys within a certain window of a 7-day rolling average of chronic load. And then within that, I will project days. So I'll work within those 7 days, building forward what those 7 days. And with Marty, we'll meet and say, okay, these days should be easy, medium, hard, or high, medium, low volume. I keep it very high level, very simple like that. And then on a day-to-day basis, in every morning, I've worked with our analytics team here in Montreal. I just get an auto-populated spreadsheet that pulls in, their standard deviations, their, 7-day rolling loads, and then we'll tweak things here and there. Typically, if a player is starting to trend high or rev hot, I'll speak to that positional coach and the athlete. I'll say to the athlete, hey, I'm noticing this. How are you feeling? What do we need to modify? Maybe we change things off the ice. And then I'll just say something to our positional coach and say, hey, player X is starting to rev hot these few days. Just keep an eye on him. Have you noticed his changing anything? Maybe instead of the extra work that happens after a practice, maybe we can have a conversation and that player just leaves the ice once practice is over. I firmly believe, my personal philosophy is I never want to prevent a player from going on the ice. That's their job. So, in very extremely rare cases will I ever say that player needs a total off day. Because we also know with the challenging movement patterns of skating, if you start to strip away those skating movement patterns, that's going to lead downstream to other hip, groin, low back, etc. So we want to keep them within their sport as best we can. I'll always make sure I have those conversations with an athlete first before I go to the coaches. And then I will work with Marty on what that day should look like specifically. So Marty and I will talk every morning. He'll say, hey, what are you thinking today before they plan practice? I'll talk to them about what it should look like. They'll plan practice. And then while practice is going on, periodically, he'll check in with me. Where are we at? How we close to that target? What are we doing? And listen, I'll be honest with you. Sometimes he blows that target completely out of the water. And that's fine. That's his prerogative. Again, it goes back to what we talked about earlier about the head coach. That's his prerogative. But then he'll come to me and be like, yeah, I know, but we had to work on this. And it's like, absolutely. You're the head coach in the moment, you do you. Because Marty also knows that behind the scenes, we'll tinker and change things 2, 3, 5 days later to account for that load that we did on that specific day.
Great. So I want to make sure, wrapping this up with a bow, 7-day average. It's not acute to chronic, like 7 by over 28. It's the rolling average. Let me ask you this question, just a tag on question. How long did it take you to say, I know what a 7-day, and I know there's no certainty in science. How much data did you need to procure to say, you know what, I get a good idea of what a 7-day average is?
Well, early on in the season, we use a 4.5 time game load for like a weekly accumulation, because we know the densest our schedule will ever get is about 4 games in 7 days. So if we just kind of bump that up a little bit, I know if we can get guys safely to 4.5 times game load within a 7-day span, that'll a good enough chronic load. How did that number come up? Honestly, conversations between Matt Price and I as we tried to figure this stuff out together. That's kind of how we landed on that. We used that till about beginning of November, so about 4 to 6 weeks in. Then we will switch to, okay, what was their 7-day rolling average in season load? Because I know our schedule is very monotonous. There's not a lot of change happening. And that allows us to kind of keep guys within a certain level. If guys start to fall out of that, it's usually due to a change in their minutes played during a game. So then we know we need to kind of just turn that dial up a little bit at the end of practice. So working with our skills coach after practice to make sure, a few players are getting those reps in. But really, players in this day and age, if they're not playing, they want to get that extra work in practice. So it's a matter of just making sure, you're kind of course correcting and adjusting the thermostat dials a little bit here and there.
Great. Today's episode has been brought to you by Physical Preparation for Ice Hockey, Biological Principles and Practical Solutions, and the Gain Go Grow Manual. This is a 2-part book series exploring training the intermediate and advanced level players. Book number 1 explores training the intermediate player. Chapters include long-term athletic development, considerations, speed training, power training, strength training, and program design. The Gain Go Grow Manual explores training the high-performance hockey player. Chapters include biomechanics of ice hockey, considerations for high performers, minimizing adaptational risks while upsizing gains, the Gain Go Grow model, and example microcycles. More information can be found at Amazon.com. Steph, back at you. American Hockey League level. I know Adam had mentioned the schedule is a little bit different. Is it very similar? And how are you using that in terms and measures of either the macro or the micro and during the course of the season?
So originally, I was in Europe. I had basically no tech. I used to monitor, weekly, our coach was really into it. So I was doing like predicted RPE and session RPE, stuff like that. So I thought, okay, I'm just going to predict what I think the Catapult player load should be for practice. So I start doing this at the start, and I'm realizing like the American Hockey League, there's so much diversity in our roster. There's no real limit. We could have up to 28, 29 guys at a time. We got some guys who are trying to develop at the same time, so they need more work. So it turns out like I'll still tag practice and break down the drills and stuff like that. And the practice in itself might hit what our target would be, but there's 4 or 5 players that might blow that number out of the water and change the average. So we look at more, I'd say we establish the average game load for a player. And now I'm looking at that more individually with guys, because these guys want to be on the ice. They want to be shooting pucks. And sometimes I got to look at this guy and say, okay, we're playing Wednesday, Friday, Saturday. So you practiced Monday, Tuesday, and your player load numbers, your load is like 120% of your game load. So you've already played 2 games now going into your Wednesday game, and we still got 2 more on the weekend. So it's like conversations of having like that with players. But then within that, we got to be careful, because if a guy just stays and just rips one-timers at the end of practice, that's going to drive his player load way up. But if we look at his skating load might not be that high. So we can't get kind of tricked by the numbers. We got to make sure we know, what we're looking at. Okay, yeah, his player load is 120% of his game load, his average game load, but his skating load was actually lower. So if you wanted to shoot 200 pucks after, well, he shot 200 pucks, and it kind of made us think he went a lot harder than he did, because we know skating load and just the player load is not exactly the same thing.
I just want to piggyback off that real quick. So a lot of times when people hear Catapult, they think that it's about workload management and getting more rest days for players, having players do less. A lot of times actually making sure the guys that are at the lower end of the spectrum are getting enough work so they're pushed up in the lineup, they're prepared to go into the game. It's a massive, massive misconception and a huge part of what we do in making sure that players are ready to go. So I just want to touch on that.
No, great point. It's funny you mentioned that. And I think Adam brought this up early in the conversation. Like, I think context is so critical. Steph, you as well, former player. Like, I remember, and you guys could correct me in this story, I think it was like a year or 2 ago. You guys remember LeBron James in the NBA Finals? Someone said he had like the worst running speeds or whatever on the court. And meanwhile, he won the championship that year and had the most points. And someone said, turn that damn thing off. You don't win like that. Different style of players, different technical packages that different teams procure during it. Maybe it's a trap. Maybe a guy's killing penalties. Maybe he's not. So I think there is an importance of the context to be put to those numbers. And there's got to be a working understanding. To me, that tells the story in conjunction with the hard metric. I call it a metric sandwich. Like, you got the number, and then you've got the assumption what you want to measure, and then you got to be able to relay that to the player. And to me, that's why I think that there's got to be context in those numbers. I want to shift here, and Kevin, I want to start with you. And I understand that you're in the infancy stages of using the technology, but maybe a better question to ask you, and then I'm going to shift it to Adam and Steph, is return to play. That is a huge element. I'm just starting out with it, and we did an N of 1 with a youngster coming back from a lower back injury this year, and we used the technology. And I felt really comfortable as I started to progress as return to play and looking at those numbers and seeing what a game would be. And I felt more objective in the decision to return them to play. But my question is, at Notre Dame, with the use of your technology, what do you want to see, or have you decided that yet, in terms of metrics that you're going to use? Let's just do a fictitious MCL injury. Mm-hmm. Have you decided your anchor points in what you want to measure, whether it's percentage of game load, whether you want to see the athlete, 2 games worth of player load before they're returned? These are just examples, but how do you drive the bus at Notre Dame in terms and measures of what you want to look at?
Right. So I don't know that I can 100% say I've got this nailed down yet. Okay. We definitely had some opportunities to play with this year. And it was the one thing that, even only being 1 year in, we weren't confident to make, drastic changes with our schedule for the team. But being able to use this for an individual return to play, it was like almost immediate how you were able to utilize these type of numbers. I mean, I felt really confident, just like you said. Once, we were even a month in and I had a decent number of practices under our belt to go look at. And especially if we had games on a certain person, if we were trying to bring them back, just to be able to use those numbers to use as targets felt like cheating in some ways compared to years of just trying to wing it and ask how they felt and just letting coaches tell me how they looked and using that. Having these objective numbers was really awesome. And being able to talk to the player about it with those numbers in hand was amazing, how the players fed into that and got really in tune with what those numbers were. And we could get to the point where I'm like, hey, I need 20% more out of you in this category today. And they would do it and feel confident trying to hit that number. That really changed the game and the return to play. I'll be honest, it was probably the one most revealing thing right off the bat 1 year in that we got out of this whole system. I don't know that I've got to truly answer your question as far as percentages that I'm trying to hit. A lot of it depends on the injury and how long they're out. Obviously, if someone that's going to be out 6 weeks, you're going to be ramping up much slower and taking it, piece by piece, as opposed to a guy like, all right, he might only miss a week here. So I just got to make sure we don't get him off the rails too far. So I think that, I don't know that we're going to end up with a cookbook. I thought originally that we would end up with a cool little just step-by-step manual on how to get somebody back to the game. But I think there's just too many variables that are going to come into that, is what I'm seeing. And, I think we all have to do it. I've got to work with my strength coach. I got to work with our coaches and just take each person individually and use the data as best we can. But I don't know that we're going to end up with this manual that I kind of hoped we would. But that's okay. I still think it's going to be extremely useful going forward. I've already seen the benefits of that.
A great point about the manual. I think it's very complex, the return to play process for sure, but one of many variables. Adam, I want to pass it to you and your return to play parameters. How do you use it? And you mentioned at the top of the podcast your volume, intensity, and asymmetry measures. Does that change for you when you're looking at it from a return to play perspective? And if so, I would like to know. And then how do you use it in the return to play?
It does change. Early on in the return to play process, we're very volume based. We need our players to safely accumulate, X amount of player load. And then towards late stage rehab, it changes to, we start focusing on some of the intensity metrics. So we're getting them at or near, game-like demands from an intensity perspective. Once they've developed the volume, it's no different than what we would do in the gym. When you think about the return to play process, or even working with healthy athletes, a system like Catapult allows us to have those objective measures like we've all talked about and Kevin just talked about, similar to what we would have in the gym. So if you think about it, you have an injured athlete, lower body, they start to work their way back. They can do trap bar deadlift, 135 pounds one day. They come in the next day. You're not going to say, great, let's do 500 pounds today, just because you're feeling great yesterday. You're going to stepwise them in a linear fashion, getting them back up to strength. Skating is the exact same way. So I don't want to say in the old days or in the past, or if you don't have, a system like Catapult, it might be very subjective. How do you feel? Well, a lot of our athletes are type A personality. They want to get back. Yep, I felt great. Yep, I feel great. And, the therapist or the on ice return to play person or your skills coach is going to go along with that. Yep, because we're all working to get that athlete back. But now you can apply the scientific process or just an objective lens to say, okay, well, today we're going to do 50% of your practice load. And if you tolerate that well and you come in today and you're feeling better, guess what? Tomorrow we're going to do 65% of your practice load. And, we're going to have a little bit of a longer duration skating. So your skating load might be a little bit higher than it was yesterday. for us, we use a simple linear fashion. And then late stage, just like you would in any off-ice return to play perspective, you start to sprinkle in a little bit of intensity, and then, your intensity kicks up as they go back, whether that's, low amplitude plyos, the higher single leg bounds, multi-directional, whatever. We use the same metrics on the ice. So for us, we work on getting them up to about 75% of their practice load, seeing how they can tolerate that. Then we start to transition to more intensity-based metrics, like I talked about earlier, player load per minute of drills, max velocity. We have we're fortunate to have our Clear Sky system here, so we want to make sure that they can tolerate max velocity. We use a metric called pace, which is distance traveled above 80% of their max velocity. So that's very similar to what Kevin mentioned earlier about like high-speed skating, or for me, it's a similar metric to high-speed running that you see in a lot of literature. And then we start looking at accel deceleration, where we know athletes are going to get that within our small-sided games or our philosophy of developing players here. So it's a matter of bringing that in slowly towards the tail end to get them, accumulated back to what we know we see in a game.
Outstanding. Last question. I don't know if you can answer this before I turn it over to Steph. Is there a rule or heuristic that you use before you clear a player? I want to see 90% of a game load. Is there a clearing for your group?
Yeah, we have certain phases through the rehab, return to play process. So we know phase one is just our early clearing. Our therapists are on the ice. It's different based on every single injury or type of injury, but they're clearing those athletes, for them. Then we'll work on building our volumes back up. So just using a simple linear progression of player load. Okay, once they've been able to tolerate that, including the increased demands off the ice, right? Because those go hand in hand. We like to consolidate stressors. So we know that if we're increasing volume one area on the ice, typically we're trying to do that off the ice. With recovery days, we'll push them up a little bit. We'll back them off the ice almost like an every other day or every third day skating as they build that load. And then kind of once they're up to and they can tolerate 75% of a practice load, then we start to turn them over to more of like our small area games, small-sided games, more of our hockey-based work with our on-ice skills coaches, our on-ice, return to play people. And then we can kind of track and fine-tune things on an individual basis there. Honestly, Ant, one of the best things about this system is the individualization. I know you talk about N=1. It happens all the time here. We're a team of 25 individuals. So the fact that we can measure and monitor what each person individually does, plus we know what each person individually does in a game, that allows us to have that roadmap to get them back to those levels.
Great point. Steph, I'm going to package this question a little bit different for you, man. Former pro hockey player, OHL star, stud, doing some RTP. Don't be so modest. I know you get on the ice with the guys and you do a lot of RTP. Let's take some of the drill sets that you would use. Walk me through how you would slowly progress player load. Is it just taking it? I know Matty Price gave a beautiful presentation on end stage rehab, and he talked about the geometry of the rink and how you change the circumference. Are these things that you iterate over time to sequentially get your drill sets, or is it just, hey, it's just a volume based, we're going to skate more? Does that question make sense?
It does. I mean, I know it's pretty easy to say it depends on the injury, but it definitely does depend on the injury. I can give you an example. Over the last 2 years, we've had some different injuries. Some could be concussions. And concussions, like once it's time to initiate contact, sometimes I'm going full gear, and like I can skip the first part. The contact part is them initiating contact because they're in control. So I'm out there, and we tried it with some other players, and they don't want to hit the other teammates, and the other guys aren't too sure when they hit them either. So, but no one cares about running me into the boards. So I'm out there full gear, get destroyed. So we always start with them initiating some stick battles first, and then them initiating contact, and then them receiving contact and stuff like that. And over these 2 years, we had we had an interesting one that I rehabbed with or did the reconditioning and stuff is with a player who had myocarditis. And that was something I hadn't really seen before. And so glad that we had this kind of technology, because when you have that, you're pretty much shut down. You can't do any real physical activity until things calm down. So it could have been 4 to 6 weeks where the athlete didn't do anything. And then it's like, okay, he's cleared. How long is it going to take to get this guy ramped up to go? So because there was no real limitations this player had, so we used the Catapult And I took, again, his average game load and said, this is the goal. I looked at his experience, pretty experienced guy. Like he's played in the league before. It's not like a guy coming out of junior that isn't even established, that really needs to work on staying in the lineup on a regular night. And with our therapist, we kind of made a plan and said, I think 2.5 weeks of this ramp up is the fastest we can do this. So what does that look like with our metrics? And I talked to Adam about this as well, and also Patrick, and they had some good input. Since it was more of a heart issue, well, what's the best way to measure that is the heart rate monitors, and that is integrated directly into the Catapult system. So we're measuring his external load from the work he's doing. That first day, I think we set it at like 30% of his average game load, just to really ease into it. And at the same time, we're measuring trim with the heart rate monitor. And we just kind of tried to climb little by little. That first week, I think we tried to finish at like 45 or 50% of his average game load. And these are our goals. It doesn't mean we're nailing it on the dot. But I was running most of the on-ice stuff, so I had it right at the bench and was monitoring it closely and like looking at the skating load and making sure that was making sense as well. And so with that, it was really pretty progressive, but this guy had no limitations. So we were getting into some position specific stuff, skill stuff. Like the 3 components I try to build into these drills, if possible. Sometimes we have one, sometimes we have all 3, is a skill component, a position specific component, and then, that work to rest ratio, more of our like fitness component. And with him, we were able to build all 3 in. If I know the player pretty well, then I'm going to make him do drills. I mean, we're going to do drills that he's used to doing. I wouldn't put anyone in a situation if they don't do any cutbacks or whatever. I mean, it could be anything. I'll try to make it as similar as possible to the way the player plays on the ice. So those are just 3 components that go into my like drill building, and then using the sports science side to track it and try to have a target. So with this athlete, we ramped him up over 2.5 weeks. Had a little bit of, maybe a day or 2 where the loads were coming down, but the intensities were staying high, and then ran him right into back-to-back games and never looked back.
Got to give you a huge compliment, buddy, because I think this to me is the future of the high performance model. You call it director of end stage rehab, whatever you want. It's to be able to fuse what you do in the gym, to be able to fuse what you do on the ice, and building trust within that athlete and bridging the gap between the gym, the ice, and practice, all under one roof. I know you do a great job of that, but I follow you on social media. Obviously, we're friends, but it's really impressive what you're doing. And I think to be able to use that to learn the technology, and then with your hockey background, come on, man, dangerous, Steph, dangerous, baby. Okay,
as his boss, and I would agree. Steph does an amazing job down there, just being able to strap on the pads and work, intimately with the guys and really understand and know what they need to play the game at the highest level, because he's been there, albeit in Europe, and his very brief cup of coffee in the OHL. I think he did a great job.
I know I say this a lot, and I know I'd say it half joking, but I mean it. That's why I think it's so important to me. Like, the perception of the numbers may be more important than the numbers themselves. And what I mean by that is to be able to relay those numbers while you have the trust with the athlete, knowing that you were a former player. Yeah, maybe that means something, maybe it doesn't, but having all that integrated into one, to me, that's a special individual. So I wanted to ask this. I want to respect everybody's time. We're almost an hour in, but I want to pass this to everybody. So give me 1 or 2 like aha moments that you said, wow, I could not have gotten this new information without having this technology or the objective information to make those decisions, if that makes sense. I'll give you an example. Adam, one of your colleagues, Stephen Nightingale, who speaks very highly of you, I asked him the same question. He said, Anth, I'll never, ever speak directly to a coach on my opinion, but I want to give him the information, and what he does with it is up to him. He said, I'm not a fan of pregame skates, right? We've collected that data over time and the player load over time, and it's the equivalent of throughout the course of the year of X amount of games. And I'm just making a fictitious number up. He said, if he ever asked me that, I'm just not a big fan. So that was an aha moment for him after he collected that information. Are there any aha moments for you, 1 or 2 that you said, wow, like, geez, this kind of changed my view or changed my opinion?
One of the metrics that kind of jumped out at me right away was looking at the goalies. We have not really done much with goalies. We'd had heart rate monitors on them, but never really, I don't know, they all just kind of got pushed aside, it seemed like, when we were really digging in on things. And to have these monitors on them and to be able to, they have a goalie algorithm to show you the down count of how many times these goalies go up and down during a practice. It was kind of mind blowing to see those numbers. In fact, I didn't trust it when I first saw it. I was like, you gotta be kidding me. There's no way that like, so I started watching it. You can see it live, like during practice. And I'm like, man, this is dead on. Like every time that guy goes down to his knees, I'm seeing 1, 2, 3 on the thing. And it's pretty eye opening to see the work that those guys have to go through. And it really sparked our strength coach and I to talk a little more about that. Of like, are we training him appropriately now off the ice for that load, now that we are really quantifying that, and does he need to maybe not be doing some of the other stuff we have our regular athletes doing, because it's just not what he does on the ice. So that was a really eye-opening one. And then just some of the other position differences, like the speeds on our defensemen are lower in games, and that was kind of eye-opening to me. I guess when you really think about it, it doesn't surprise you, but it's just, I didn't expect that to be so drastic. Depends on the player. Some players get up in the rush a lot more, and you see more load and speed. But our stay-at-home D guys, like they don't do a lot in some of these categories that our forwards do. So same thing, just kind of opened our eyes from a training aspect of, are we addressing their individual needs well enough? And I think we'll continue to build that going forward, but it'll be pretty cool.
Outstanding. Adam, I want to pass that to you.
Sure. I'll talk about one of the aha moments, but also kind of one of the big wins I had with coaches and athletes from that perspective is, I want to say it was probably about 2016, 2017, the Hockey Canada, the national women's team, was preparing for the Olympics in Korea. And what they do is they run a centralized system. So August, September of every year, the players who have been selected to try out for that team meet in Calgary, and they play various international games. They play games against midget AAA teams. They play games against junior B men's teams to get ready for the Olympics. And, I was not working directly with the team, but in my role as, I can't remember what my title used to be back then, manager of sport performance, I think, with Hockey Canada, I was working with the coaches and the strength coaches. I was watching their catapult. My project was kind of helping them understand the catapult system and how to best manage and monitor their players. The coaches were noticing that in games, the defensemen especially weren't able to maintain their intensity level in games. And they're like, we don't understand. Like, this is, we can see it. And we could see it in the data, throughout the course of a game, intensity was dropping. And we know that across 3 periods, sure, intensity is going to go down. But, through training and conditioning, everything, you want to try to minimize the slope of that line or help them maintain that intensity. And they were running a regular schedule, practice, 3 to 4 times a week, games 2 to 3 times a week, off days sprinkled in here and there. They're running like an in-season schedule as they prepare for the Olympics. And so what we started to do is look at intensity in practice and said, okay, well, we know they're in shape. These athletes are the best women's hockey players in the world. And so we know fitness isn't an issue. And then we confirmed that with some of the physiological testing and the fitness testing that we do. Said, okay, fitness isn't a problem. But we started to look at what was happening in practice. And at that time, in women's hockey, USA was at the top. They were the best team. They played a very big possession style game. And so a lot of practices, tactically, were about how can Canada shut that down, break that down? What, trap system can we run? How do we do that? And what we were noticing in practice was a lot of defensemen just weren't getting intensity. Because if you think about it, the coaches were building drills and stuff to shut down this possession style. So the defensemen a lot of times were starting the drill and then gapping up or coasting through the neutral zone and, kind of playing at that 3/4. And so we noticed that as we started to look through some of the data and said, listen, like, you're tactically preparing your team to win. That's great. But the demands you're pacing your players under 3 to 4 times a week isn't matching how you want them to ultimately be able to express themselves in a game. And so that was kind of a light bulb moment for the coaches. They're like, that's correct. Like, we are trying to create drills and systems to shut this down. The defensemen, aren't getting that intensity that they're going to see in a game. And so, to the coach's credit, when they do forward D split, like happens in a lot of hockey practices, what did defensemen, typically do? They go to one end and they work on getting pucks off the wall, pulling it to the middle and launching a slap shot. What our coaches did instead of doing drills like that is they started doing on ice intensity. So they started doing more sprint based work. They started really focusing on those D-split periods of increasing the intensity that they're hitting their players with. And sure enough, we saw after that, conversations, interventions, that intensity level started to rise back up in games. And our coaches and our players too, were like, wow, we can see the before and after, the pre and post with some of the metrics that Catapult puts out, like explosive efforts, high intensity minutes, etc. We saw those numbers start to trend back up. So that was a big moment. And it was a big win with our coaches because they brought us what they were seeing. We were able to comb through the numbers to find a potential solution or reason why, and then course correct and make adjustments that ultimately help the players have better success on the ice.
Fantastic. Steph.
I'll go back to my first year in Laval. So new to Catapult, collecting data all year. At the start was kind of overwhelming, then started to get a lot more comfortable with it. But it was really come playoff time. So we finished, I think, third in our division, had a good push and made the playoffs. And we weren't really expected to go very far. We ended up losing game 7 of the conference final. So we had a really good run. And throughout the playoffs, I was looking at, again, individual average game load of these players. And I was getting, the talks with the coaches are really brief. And I always joke about it. And we have a great head coach, JF Wool. And if he comes to ask me a question, by the time I start answering, he's usually like walking backwards and getting further away. He wants it like really, really brief, which is awesome.
Reader's Digest, baby. Reader's Digest.
Yeah. So he's the best. So I know that now. So what basically he was coming up like, hey, I don't know. I think we look tired. Last game or someone's we look tired. I'm like, okay, well, listen, I can look at our intensity and I'll look at each player's intensity compared to his average game intensity throughout the season. And that was a really good way for us to say, like, okay, maybe they're not tired. Like all of these guys were above 100%. Everyone brought up their level above 100% of their intensity from the season. So I showed them that, and it was a quick switch. Like, okay, yeah, maybe it was something else. Maybe they're slowing us down in the neutral zone. It gets more contextual after that, as opposed to the old sort of like, oh, we look tired. We look tired. Well, maybe we were just getting slowed down. Maybe something was happening. So that was the aha moment for sure. And then I'll take you to the clinching game against Rochester in the second round, triple overtime. So we go into 3 OTs. We beat them. I download the data on the bus on the way back, and I see that every single player was above 100% of his intensity. And this is through 3 overtimes. Wow. So to see that in the playoffs in a clinching game, I was like, wow, this is awesome. And it just makes us look good too at the same time.
But I think Steph's story there brings up another good point about using the information to help frame coaches' perception, because you never want to use this information against an athlete. That's the surefire, fastest way to lose the team and the compliance and everything. But Steph was able to stick up for his athletes. The coach said, oh, they look slow, they look tired. Well, we know our players are fit. Like if you're playing an American League schedule or a National Hockey League schedule, fitness isn't an issue, but it's easy to change the coach's perception. I've had similar conversations where they're like, oh, we started slow tonight, or we didn't have the jump. And you can look at the information, the numbers, and say, actually, that's, game data is fairly homogenous. Like there was no change there. Maybe it's just the fact that we got scored on twice in the first 2 minutes because player X had a breakdown somewhere. But it's really important that you protect your players that way and you stick up for them, because the coaches, you don't want to give them an opportunity to pile on. Because if, JF said, we were tired tonight, and Steph looks at the numbers and rightly or wrongly says, oh yeah, the guys were a little bit off, they're going to have that buried into their brain. And then they're going to go down to the coaches room and be like, yeah, Steph said the numbers showed guys were off. And then that totally goes against what you're going to do the next day or whatever. And so it's really important that, we always use those numbers every opportunity we can to pump the tires of the athletes.
One of the things that I found recently, it's kind of like just a hidden relic. Adam and I had talked about this when I was working with Edmonton, but you actually can measure and quantify the impacts that players are having in a game. So now we don't just have volume, intensity, density. We also have context and collisions you can monitor as well. So that device will give you G-forces for every single collision. I've paired it with video, found one hit that was massive. There's 3 IMA impacts that happen within a matter of, I think it's half a second. It's the player getting hit, the player hitting the boards, and then the player hitting the ice. And it came out to 32 Gs just from one single hit. So interesting thing for people to keep in mind. Definitely an aha moment, and probably more questions are coming out of it for me now. It's like, okay, we need to prepare players for those collisions. How do you do it safely? And how do you do it without getting someone hurt? So definitely more questions than answers right now, but definitely cool to see that you can quantify collisions.
Fantastic. So I want to open, whoever feels like answering this, please speak up. I think everyone, Kevin, with the exception of you, a year and a half ago, we all listened to Bab speak about his career and his coaching. And at one point, I think I asked him, about, performance, et cetera. And I realized every coach is different. But at the time he said, look, I want a Reader's Digest. Don't give me a soliloquy. Give me a Reader's Digest of what's important. And again, context aside, we're talking about Babs. Everyone's different. My question to you is, if it's a game, Steph, and maybe Adam for you, if it's a week, what are your Reader's Digests that, hey, this is your piece of paper. I got 3 minutes. I want to see something, and you better tell me a story. Goodbye with a coaching staff. I want to set you up for success. But what would you say if you had 1 or 2 items that you had Reader's Digest from your Catapult information? What would you put on it, and why would you put it on?
So, and it's really funny you asked that question because, in this day and age, I think there's a lot of focus, especially in social media, about dashboards. People spend so much time trying to make their dashboards look good, trying to figure out what metrics are on there. Last year, Marty St. Louis joined us in February of last year. So a lot of times through the last back of the season, he was drinking out of fire hose. First time as a National Hockey League coach. He was trying to figure out, what was going on, the players, etc. And I just kept doing what I always did, which was practice reports, email, the short blurb. For me, there's always 2 parts to the email. The first part was a brief description, 2 or 3 bullet points about what the session looked like. It could have been why guys accumulated certain loads or whatever. And then the second section was always suggestions and recommendations. I never try to tell people what to do, similar to what you said about Steve Nightingale. We never try to tell them what to do, but I'll give them suggestions and recommendations of those numbers or numbers to come. Well, when we were having our preseason meetings, Marty came to me this year and was like, listen, I'm going to tell you that I never open your emails. He's like, don't take that as a slight or anything. I get thousands of emails a day. He said, I want to talk to you face to face. And if it's important, print it off and hand it to you. So great. Honestly, that saved me a bunch of time because now I don't do reports anymore. So great. I look at the information and Marty and I will talk. We usually talk before practice, so the day, and that is framed with how are our guys doing? What do we need to do today? And then after practice, it's did we hit that target and how do we need to adjust the other day? So for him, the communication style he wanted was verbal, and which is great because I can now provide him the context. Listen, I still have spreadsheets, dashboards, charts, everything like that, but he doesn't want to see any of that. So I look at that information, synthesize it, and put it into the perspective that he wants. Periodically, if something's very important, guess what? I print it out. I walk down to his office, I hand it to him, he looks at it, and we talk about it. So, I think that's key within your environment, but that's how we synthesize that information. And that's how I communicate it because that's what he wants. And so I talk to him about volume and intensity. Here's what we need, high, medium, low on both of those and why. And then, usually that morning, when we talk about what the day is going to look like, we'll talk about the next 2 to 3 days at the same time.
Fantastic. Steph.
Okay, so for a game, I haven't been told yet to stop sending the emails, so I'm still sending them. I try to get them out post-game, like within an hour. If we're at home, I'll grab the units right away, start downloading them while guys are coming in to get their workout, and then I'll take care of the report as soon as they're gone. If it's on the road, this is like a mad scramble. If we're leaving the rink, I'm going through bags, grabbing through their shoulder pads, getting the units because we're packing up when we're getting out of here. So I got to get those units before they get packed up and get on the bus. That's just the way I said I was going to do it. I don't know if JF looks at that night, but for consistency, it's done, and he gets it that night. I send out 2 reports. I send out a team, like a game report, which gives us our average player load for the whole team, average intensity. And then I also send out a goalie report, which goes to everybody, but especially the goalie coach. We don't really have any quick like chats on the bus or at home, other than I think maybe a couple times when we have back-to-back games and we got 2 goalies and it's like, okay, this goalie played Wednesday, Friday. Is he good to go for that Saturday afternoon game? And then we just look like, holy crap. Like tonight we were up by 3 goals. The other team pulled their goalie with 7 minutes left, and our goalie got peppered, and he ends up having, like, we tracked how many times they go up and down. If we compare his Wednesday or his regular like average, he ended up, maybe he goes down 70 times up and down in a game. Well, this time he went down 129 times because they had the goalie out for so long. So it's like, well, maybe we got to go with the other guy. If they were hesitant about it, at least they had that information on, like, holy crap, way above what he's used to. But I mean, other than a lot of times it'll confirm what the coach saw. Like we'll have a chat maybe at breakfast the next day and be like, hey, how's the catapult? Like it's kind of like a general question. Yeah. Be like, wow, the intensity was way higher than usual. He's like, yeah, I felt that we were hitting a lot more. Like it usually is kind of confirming what he sees.
Sure.
But it's not really like, I'm not going to see him after the game or anything like that. Yeah. It just kind of fuels like the conversation. I know he looks at it, but does he look at it that in depth? No. But what JF expects is that if there's something that's really standing out, like that goalie stuff, that I'm going to talk to him. And if I don't go to talk to him, then for him, everything should be somewhat status quo. So we kind of roll like that throughout the season.
Excellent. Kev.
Yeah, so I started the season saying I wasn't going to give any information out to my coaches just because I didn't know what we were really looking at.
Yeah, that's not a bad way to. That's not a bad way to start though. Under promise and over deliver if you have to, right?
Probably the best way.
It sure didn't last long though. I think there was just enough excitement about we had installed this satellite system in the building and we had all this buy-in and all the guys got these new monitors and the questions started coming pretty quick about, well, what are we seeing? Can we use it? Can it help us? And I still really tried to be very cautious about providing a whole lot of insights about what the info meant, but I felt that we probably did need to start showing something. So we kept it very basic and we're just giving a very basic report every day to the coaches of this was everybody's player load. This is how it looks compared to their average. And then we tried to start a language of talking everything in like percent of a game load. So that really helped like during the week of say, okay, our forwards were at 65% of a game load today in practice, and then I kept getting that. Is that good? And I said, well, I don't know. This is why we weren't going to give info yet because we don't know what that means. Is that what we need to be at every day of the week? Probably not, but let's just keep looking at it and see if we can garner anything out of it. So we did a daily report that looked very similar on game day and practice day for now. I'm already kind of envisioning how that's going to change a little bit going forward, but we did a very basic intensity and a player load, and then did both of those in a percentage of a game load for each category. I had my own things that I was looking at. I got probably way deeper than I needed to this year into some metrics because I got really intrigued by some of the other things and tried my best to keep a lot of that from the coaches because I just didn't want to overwhelm them this year. I did have some players, though. I mentioned before, like buy-in from some of the players was pretty cool that started asking questions. I had a separate report that I would post up just to print it out on a bulletin board kind of thing for the players. And it was amazing how often they were coming in and looking at that and then creating questions. And several guys that wanted to sit down at the computer with me, and we got dug into some of the deeper metrics a little bit of some of them. And that buy-in was pretty cool because that spreads through the locker room too, and then creates an environment that guys are interested in taking some ownership of what's going on out there. So,
Patrick, could you tell us a little bit more about where we could find the product, contact information? I know obviously I'm in a private facility. I'm starting to use it. I think it might be more and more popular in the private facility for smaller businesses working with teams. I know obviously the National Hockey League level, you guys have a big demographic, college. How can people find more about the product? How can they get in touch with you?
Yeah, catapultsports.com, probably the easiest place to go to. As far as reaching out to me, patrick.love@catapult.com is my email. Pretty responsive on there. You can find me on LinkedIn. I do some stuff on Twitter and Instagram every now and again, but not very often. Just want to highlight this. So we're going to be coming out with a new product, Vector Core. It's going to be a little bit more budget friendly, I guess, for lack of a better term. It's indoor, outdoor. Probably in hockey, the only metrics that you're going to get that you're going to care about is heart rate, player load, and then impact. or on ice. But off ice, you can tap into the GPS. You can get acceleration, deceleration, any of the positional data that you care about. So for you, Ant, for your go days, that might be really important to have in the monitor. Yeah, food for thought on that.
Fantastic. Our guests today have been Patrick Love, Adam Douglas, Stephane Gervais, Kevin Ricks. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us.